right, I want to talk for a moment about gun violence in this country and rules and laws around gun control. And the reason I want to talk about it today is because while we are distracted by President Trump breaking into primetime television to do a musical number, and I just wanted to see if you were listening. You know, he didn't really do a musical number. But while we're distracted by that, there are some folks trying to actually get laws passed in this country. And in particular, there was some legislation in the House having to do with gun control. And Lucy McBath, our newly elected congresswoman from the 6th District here in Georgia, was a part of that legislation. This is the exact issue that she said she was going to Congress to deal with. She, of course, the mother of a son who was killed by gun violence, and she, of course, winning on that platform, essentially. So she co-sponsored a bill that would expand background checks for the sale and transfer of firearms. This is a piece of legislation that most people are behind. Most Americans are behind. And yet there is not a lot of likelihood that this piece of legislation is going to pass the Senate. So that is something that should be considered an issue for all Americans, regardless of party. And if you want to talk about something being a crisis in this country, I think you have to look at gun violence. Now, I'm not saying we should be declaring a national emergency over gun violence or shutting down the government over gun violence, but I am saying it's a real problem in this country, and one that, for the most part, Republicans refuse to deal with while people continue to die. One of the moments that I think was captured on television sort of from a distance was Gabby Giffords and Steve Scalise sharing a hug on the floor, at both, of course, victims of gun violence themselves personally, survivors of gun violence. So, and I think, if I'm not wrong, I think yesterday was the anniversary of the date that Gabby Giffords was shot. I may have that wrong, but that was a really poignant moment. And yet, the legislation's still not likely to go anywhere. So. That's one where I almost want to say shame on you, because there's no reason why we shouldn't have expanded background checks. The only reason that you could possibly say that that's not something you want is if you're all about protecting the money, the people who are making money by selling guns to people who shouldn't be getting them. And there you're choosing money over life. You're choosing financial gain over life. There's no other way to say that. So I just wanted to mention that quickly because I wanted to sort of let everyone know that Lucy McBath is doing what she said she was going to do now that she is officially a member of Congress. And also just because shame on you if you can't get behind that. I just don't understand that. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who is a gun owner. And I think I've said this before. I'm not anti-gun. I have gone to the shooting range. I've gone to the driving range too, but that's a whole other thing. I've gone to the shooting range and I have fired a handgun, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun, except I wasn't particularly good at it, and it is very loud. But other than that, I liked it. I thought it was cool. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have gun control. And so I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to own guns. And he was saying, yeah, I do believe in gun control. And he also made a really important point, I think. And this is a friend of mine who owns some businesses that are in, questionable neighborhoods where violence occurs regularly. And so one of the guns he purchased was specifically to protect himself and the businesses when he's there, because he goes there with a fair amount of cash. And so he was saying, look, I was going there with a loaded gun, on a regular basis. And at one point I stopped and I said to myself, what is the value of a human life? I'm carrying a couple $1,000 in cash, let's say. Is it worth $2,000 or $3,000 or $1,000? Is somebody's life worth $1,000 or $2,000? And he answered himself and said, no. So if somebody, comes after me and tries to take the money, I'm not willing to kill them over it. I'll let him have the money, and no longer carries this loaded gun with him. So I thought that was something worth thinking about, because you talk about having a gun for protection, even though in my opinion, that is really not what the Second Amendment says. But if you want to carry that argument, and I've heard a lot of people do it, in particular, right-wing talk radio hosts. In fact, there's one named Dana who I've heard say that exact thing. She has said that, she lived alone as a single woman, in college, and she had a gun and she wouldn't have it any other way. But even if you want to argue that, if someone's trying to kill you, maybe a different story, right? But because then your life over their life, I'm going to choose mine every day, right? But if you're talking about a stick up, a hold up, cash, and honestly, that is why most people break into homes. It's not to kill you. It's to take your stuff. So if someone comes in to take your stuff, is it worth taking a life? Is it? I think it's an important question to ask yourself. In any case, I thought it was a really important point. That friend of mine, doesn't want guns to go away, but agrees that we should have gun control. And I think that's what most reasonable people across both sides of the aisle want. And this idea of having universal background checks and have that expansion so that it's covering everybody and there's no more loophole makes total sense to me. So can we get that done, please?